Vivian Whitmore lifted her crystal champagne glass with a smile so polished it almost hid the cruelty underneath. "Tonight," she said loudly enough for the entire dining room to hear, "I'd like to toast my daughter-in-law, Hazel, for surviving another year of disappointing this family." Laughter rippled across the long Christmas table. Hazel felt her throat tighten as Vivian calmly listed her failures one by one. No children, no career anymore, no contribution worthy of the Whitmore name. And the worst part, her husband Dalton just sat there, silent, watching. Something inside Hazel finally broke. Then she stood up, slowly reached into her purse, and smiled. "Well," she said softly, "since we're making lists tonight, I brought a much longer one. If you've ever stayed quiet, while people mistook your kindness for weakness, this story is going to hit hard. And trust me, the Christmas dinner was only the beginning." 8 years earlier, before the Whitmore mansion, before the humiliation, before Hazel Foster learned how dangerous silence could become, she had been standing on a rainy sidewalk in downtown Chicago with coffee spilled down the front of her coat. And Dalton Whitmore had smiled at her like she was the only woman in the city. Back then, he didn't feel dangerous. He felt safe. Hazel still remembered the way he had laughed while handing her napkins outside the little cafe on Wabash Avenue. "You look like you're reconsidering all your life choices," he joked. "I definitely am," she had answered, staring down at the coffee stains spreading across her cream-colored blouse. He'd asked her to dinner 3 days later. Hazel had almost said no. At 28, she was exhausted from working 80-hour weeks at an architecture firm that treated junior designers like machines instead of people. She barely slept, barely dated, barely stopped moving long enough to breathe. But Dalton was persistent in a charming way. Not arrogant. Not yet. He sent flowers to her office with a handwritten note. "You deserve one peaceful evening. Let me try." And somehow, he did. With Dalton, life initially felt softer, easier. He listened when she spoke about architecture like it mattered. He remembered tiny details about her. He made her laugh until wine came out of her nose during their third date. For the first time in years, Hazel felt seen. The truth was, Hazel had spent most of her life feeling invisible. She grew up in a middle-class neighborhood outside Milwaukee, with hard-working parents who loved deeply but struggled financially. Nothing in her childhood resembled the polished wealth of Dalton's world. Her mother clipped coupons. Her father repaired old appliances instead of replacing them. Every achievement Hazel earned came through sacrifice. Scholarships, internships, sleepless nights. Nothing had ever been handed to her. That was part of why Dalton fascinated her. He belonged to a world that looked effortless. Luxury hotels, private clubs, old money. The Whitmores weren't billionaire flashy rich. They were worse. They were generational wealth rich. The kind of family that cared about bloodlines appearances and social positioning more than emotions. Hazel didn't understand that in the beginning. She only saw Dalton. And Dalton at first adored her openly. When he proposed a year later on a rooftop overlooking the Chicago skyline, Hazel cried before he even finished asking. "You're my peace," he whispered against her forehead. She believed him. God, she really believed him. The first warning sign came from Vivian Whitmore. Dalton's mother greeted Hazel at their engagement dinner with a smile sharp enough to cut glass. "Oh," Vivian had said softly after looking Hazel up and down. "You're prettier than Dalton described." Hazel smiled nervously. "Thank you." Vivian sipped her wine. "It's just surprising," Mom Dalton warned lightly. But Vivian ignored him. "Our family usually marries within certain circles." Hazel remembered the uncomfortable silence that followed. Dalton squeezed her hand under the table afterward and told her not to take it personally. "She's like that with everyone." That became the excuse for years. "She's like that with everyone. Ignore her. Don't let her get to you. She doesn't mean it." But Vivian always meant it, especially with Hazel. After the wedding, Hazel slowly began shrinking herself to fit into Dalton's world. At first, it felt harmless. She changed the way she dressed because Vivian once called one of her outfits aggressively middle class. She softened her Milwaukee accent after one of Dalton's cousins mocked it during Thanksgiving. She learned which forks belonged to which course, which wine glasses to use, how to smile politely while people insulted her indirectly across dinner tables. And every single time she bent herself smaller, Dalton kissed her forehead and thanked her for trying. Hazel thought compromise was part of marriage. She didn't realize she was slowly disappearing. 3 years into the marriage, Dalton's career accelerated rapidly inside Whitmore Capital, the family investment company headquartered in Manhattan. Hazel celebrated every promotion like it was her own, because in many ways, it was. When Dalton worked late nights, Hazel stayed awake organizing client dinners for him. When he panicked before presentations, she helped rewrite his speeches. When Vivian underwent hip surgery, Hazel was the one sleeping overnight in the hospital room while Dalton traveled for work. Vivian never thanked her, not once. Instead, 6 weeks after surgery, Vivian complained to a friend during brunch that Hazel lacked natural elegance. Hazel overheard it while carrying coffee into the dining room. That should have been enough, but love makes intelligent women negotiate with pain, especially when the man beside them keeps saying, "You know how mom is." Over time, Hazel stopped talking about her own dreams entirely. Architecture became something she used to love. Her former co-workers kept asking when she'd return to full-time design. Eventually, they stopped asking. Dalton always had reasons why her career needed to wait. "We might move. My schedule's crazy right now. Can you just support me through this next phase?" And Hazel did. Again and again and again. Until one day, she looked up and realized she had built everyone's life except her own. The realization didn't happen all at once. It happened quietly, in pieces. A forgotten anniversary dinner, Dalton checking his phone while she spoke, Vivian introducing her at parties as my son's wife. Never Hazel, never an architect, never a person, just an attachment. The loneliness became unbearable after 7 years. By then, Dalton barely touched her anymore. Their conversations revolved around schedules, events, obligations, not feelings. Never feelings. Hazel blamed herself for a long time. Maybe she wasn't exciting enough anymore. Maybe she'd become too emotional. Maybe Vivian was right. Maybe she really wasn't enough for this family. But deep down, another part of her had started waking up. A quieter part. A sharper part. That part began keeping records. Not intentionally at first. Just screenshots, emails, receipts, cruel comments saved in notes after wine-soaked dinners left her crying alone in bathrooms. Hazel told herself she was documenting reality because the Whitmores had a way of rewriting it later. Especially Dalton. He could wound her deeply at night and act loving the next morning until she questioned her own memory. "You're overreacting." "That's not what I meant." "You always make things dramatic." Eventually, Hazel stopped trusting her emotions. So she trusted evidence instead. And evidence didn't lie. On the night everything finally shifted, snow fell heavily outside their Connecticut home, while Dalton showered upstairs after returning from another business trip. Hazel wasn't searching for proof. Not exactly. She was hanging his coat when something slipped from the inside pocket and fell onto the hardwood floor. A receipt. The Langford Hotel, Manhattan, 1 king suite, 2 guests. Hazel stared at the paper so long her vision blurred. Then she looked at the date. 3 days earlier, the same night Dalton told her he'd fallen asleep in his office. Her fingers trembled slightly as she turned the receipt over. Written across the bottom in elegant cursive handwriting were 2 words, "Miss you already." And beneath it, a lipstick kiss. Hazel didn't confront Dalton about the hotel receipt. Not the next morning, not the next week. And not because she was weak, because somewhere deep inside her, beneath the grief and humiliation and disbelief, she already knew the truth. Women always knew before the evidence arrived. The evidence just made the pain undeniable. So instead of confronting him, Hazel started watching him, really watching him. And once she did, she realized how many things she had ignored to survive the marriage. Dalton had changed gradually enough that she barely noticed it happening. First, it was the late-night work calls, then the emergency meetings, then the constant business trips to Manhattan that somehow required expensive cologne and freshly tailored suits. But now that Hazel was paying attention, the details screamed at her. He angled his phone away when texting. He smiled at messages he never shared. He stopped kissing her naturally. Everything felt scheduled, obligatory, performative. One Thursday morning, Hazel stood in the kitchen stirring cream into her coffee while Dalton adjusted his cufflinks nearby. "You're going into the city again?" she asked carefully. Dalton grabbed his car keys without looking at her. "Board meetings all day. You'll stay overnight." "Probably." His answer came too quickly. Hazel nodded slowly. "I thought maybe we could have dinner tomorrow. Just us." For half a second, Dalton looked irritated. Not guilty. Irritated. Like she had become another task demanding time from him. "We'll see," he muttered. Then he kissed the top of her head absent-mindedly and walked out to the door. Hazel stood frozen in the kitchen long after she heard the car disappear down the driveway. Because once upon a time, Dalton used to look excited to come home to her. Now he looked relieved to leave. That afternoon, Vivian invited Hazel to lunch at the Greenwich Country Club. Hazel almost declined. But experience had taught her declining Vivian's invitations only created bigger problems later. So she went. The club was decorated in extravagant Christmas decor. Towering trees wrapped in gold ribbon crystal chandeliers glittering above wealthy women pretending not to gossip while absolutely gossiping. Vivian sat perfectly poised near the window in a cream cashmere dress that probably cost more than Hazel's first apartment. "You're late," Vivian said coolly as Hazel approached. "I'm 3 minutes early." Vivian smiled faintly. "Exactly." Hazel sat down quietly. The waiter poured sparkling water while Vivian studied her with that familiar expression, one part judgment, one part amusement. "You look tired," Vivian commented. Hazel stirred lemon into her water. "I didn't sleep well." Vivian folded her napkin delicately across her lap. "You know Dalton's under tremendous pressure lately." Hazel already recognized the setup. Everything with Vivian was strategic. Every sentence had hidden teeth. "I know," Hazel replied carefully. Vivian tilted her head. "Do you?" There it was. Hazel kept her expression neutral. Vivian continued. "A man like Dalton needs peace at home, stability, admiration." Hazel felt irritation flicker in her chest. "I support Dalton." Vivian gave a soft laugh. "You used to." Hazel's stomach tightened. "What's that supposed to mean?" Vivian leaned back in her chair. "You've become emotional these last few years." Hazel stared at her in disbelief. Emotional. As if loneliness was irrational. As if neglect was imagined. As if 8 years of shrinking herself wasn't exhausting. "I think most people would struggle being criticized constantly," Hazel said quietly. Vivian smiled again. That cold, polished smile. "Oh, sweetheart, criticism only hurts when there's truth in it." Hazel suddenly lost her appetite entirely. She spent the rest of lunch barely speaking while Vivian casually discussed charity galas, social events, and the importance of maintaining appearances. Hazel noticed something else too. Vivian kept mentioning a woman named Savannah. At first, indirectly, then repeatedly. Savannah organized the investor dinner beautifully. Savannah has wonderful instincts with people. Savannah reminds me of myself at that age. By the fourth mention, Hazel finally asked, "Who exactly is Savannah?" Vivian dabbed her lips with a napkin. "Dalton's PR director." Something in Vivian's eyes shifted. Subtle, but intentional. She's lovely, Vivian added. Very ambitious. Hazel suddenly understood. This wasn't random conversation. Vivian wanted her uncomfortable, and somehow that made everything worse. Because if Vivian approved of Savannah, then this had likely been happening for a while. The drive home felt endless. Snow blurred across the windshield, while Hazel replayed every interaction from the past year. Every canceled dinner, every distracted smile, every moment Dalton touched his phone more lovingly than he touched her. By the time she reached home, her chest physically hurt. Still, she didn't cry. Not yet. That night, Dalton returned unusually cheerful. Hazel noticed it immediately. He loosened his tie while pouring whiskey in the kitchen. "How was your day?" he asked, casually. Hazel studied him carefully. Too carefully. And for the first time in years, Dalton seemed uncomfortable under her gaze. "Fine," she answered. "You sure I had lunch with your mother?" Dalton groaned immediately. "Well, there's your problem." Hazel almost laughed at the irony. The man who spent years allowing emotional abuse now wanted to joke about it. "She mentioned Savannah." Hazel said carefully. Dalton's hand paused briefly on his glass. Tiny. Almost invisible. But Hazel caught it. "She's on the PR team," he said too casually. "Why?" "No reason." Dalton relaxed instantly. That reaction told Hazel more than words ever could. Later that night, Dalton fell asleep beside her while scrolling through his phone. Hazel waited. 5 minutes. 10. His breathing deepened. Slowly, carefully, Hazel reached for the phone beside him. Her heart hammered violently. She already hated herself for doing this, but another part of her, the wounded, exhausted part, needed confirmation. The passcode hadn't changed. Still her birthday. The cruelty of that nearly made her sick. Inside the messages, there were dozens of harmless conversations, coworkers, emails, group chats. Normal. Hazel almost convinced herself she had imagined everything. Then she found the archived thread. Savannah. Her stomach dropped instantly. The messages weren't even subtle. Last night was worth every risk. She suspects something. Christmas will be easier after. Hazel stopped breathing. Her hands trembled violently now. There were photos too. Savannah in a hotel mirror wearing Dalton's dress shirt. Dalton's hand on Savannah's thigh at a restaurant. One image of the two of them laughing in bed. Hazel felt like someone had reached inside her chest and physically torn something apart. 8 years. 8 years reduced to hidden messages in hotel rooms. The worst part wasn't even the affair itself. It was how normal Dalton acted afterward. How easily he lied. How comfortably he came home to her after touching another woman. Hazel locked the phone carefully and placed it back exactly where she found it. Then she walked silently into the bathroom and closed the door. Only then did she let herself break. She pressed both hands over her mouth to stop the sound of her sobs. Tears streamed uncontrollably while she slid to the cold marble floor. Her entire body shook violently. Not because she lost Dalton, because deep down she realized she had lost herself trying to keep him. And somehow, unbelievably, the night still wasn't finished, hurting her. A few minutes later, Hazel heard Dalton's phone vibrate again from the bedroom. She wiped her face quickly. Something pulled her back. One final instinct. One final wound, waiting to happen. Hazel picked up the phone again and saw the newest message appear across the screen. From Savannah. After Christmas, you won't have to pretend with her anymore. 3 dots appeared immediately afterward. Then another message arrived. I'm tired of sharing you. Hazel stared numbly at the glowing screen, and from beside her in bed half asleep, Dalton smiled. Actually smiled. At another woman. After discovering the affair, Hazel stopped sleeping properly. Not because she kept crying. Oddly, the tears faded faster than expected. What replaced them was worse. Clarity. Cold, brutal clarity. Once the illusion shattered, Hazel started noticing things she had spent years trying not to see. Like how Dalton only touched her in public now. How he became impatient whenever she spoke too long. How Vivian's cruelty had never been subtle. Hazel had simply normalized it to survive. 3 days after reading Savannah's messages, Hazel stood in the Whitmore mansion kitchen helping prepare for the annual Christmas charity brunch Vivian hosted every December. The mansion looked like something out of a luxury magazine, spread towering wreaths wrapped in gold ribbon white orchids everywhere, silver serving trays lined across marble countertops. Perfection. Everything about the Whitmores was designed to look perfect, even while rotting underneath. Hazel arranged pastries onto crystal plates while chefs moved around her preparing catered dishes. Vivian entered the kitchen wearing an ivory silk blouse and pearls, looking immaculate as always. Her eyes immediately scanned Hazel critically. "You look pale." Hazel kept placing pastries onto the tray. "I'm tired." Vivian walked closer. "Well, try harder not to look miserable today. The Holloways are attending, and Eleanor Holloway notices everything." Hazel almost laughed. Of course that was the concern. Not whether Hazel was okay, whether she looked okay. "I'll survive," Hazel answered quietly. Vivian crossed her arms. "That remains to be seen." Hazel finally looked up. "What does that mean?" Vivian tilted her head slightly. "You've been emotionally unstable lately." There it was again. Emotionally unstable. The elegant upper-class version of shut up. Hazel stared at her mother-in-law for several seconds. Years ago, comments like that would have shattered her confidence for days. Now, they only exhausted her. "You know," Hazel said carefully, "it's interesting how every emotion I have becomes a problem in this family." Vivian's expression cooled instantly. "Oh, please, don't start playing victim." Hazel felt anger flicker beneath her ribs. Not explosive anger. Something quieter, sharper. "You've treated me like an outsider since the day Dalton introduced us." Vivian gave a soft, dismissive laugh. "I treated you exactly as you presented yourself." Hazel blinked slowly. "And how was that?" Vivian stepped closer, lowering her voice. "A temporary phase." The words landed harder than Hazel expected. Not because they hurt, because Vivian truly meant them. To this woman, Hazel had never been a person, only a mistake Dalton was eventually supposed to outgrow. "You think I ruined his life?" Hazel said quietly. Vivian didn't even deny it. "I think Dalton was destined for extraordinary things," she replied calmly. "And extraordinary men require certain types of women beside them." Hazel folded her arms. "And I wasn't the right type." Vivian's eyes swept over her. "No. The cruelty was so casual, so effortless." Hazel suddenly understood something terrifying. Vivian genuinely believed her emotional abuse was justified. To her, protecting the Whitmore family image mattered more than kindness, more than humanity, more than her own son's marriage. Hazel opened her mouth to respond, but footsteps interrupted them. Dalton entered the kitchen adjusting his watch. "There you both are." Vivian's entire face softened instantly for her son. It was honestly disturbing how quickly she transformed around him. "My darling," she smiled warmly. Hazel watched the difference carefully. Vivian had never looked at her with warmth once in 8 years. Dalton kissed his mother's cheek, then glanced toward Hazel. "You okay?" The question almost offended her now, because he only asked when she visibly looked exhausted. Never deeply enough to actually understand why. "I'm fine," Hazel answered automatically. Dalton nodded distractedly. His phone buzzed. Hazel saw it happen. The tiny shift in his face, the immediate attention, the subtle smile he tried to suppress. "Savannah." It had to be. He typed a response quickly while Vivian pretended not to notice, but Hazel noticed something else. Vivian definitely knew. Not just suspected. Knew. Because there was no shock in her expression. No concern, no discomfort, watching her married son secretly message another woman beside his wife. Instead, Vivian looked almost pleased. That realization made Hazel physically cold. Later that afternoon, guests filled the mansion with expensive perfume, polished laughter, and fake warmth. Hazel moved through the crowd automatically smiling when required greeting people she barely remembered. A few women complimented her dress. A few men asked where Dalton was. Most people spoke to her politely, while still somehow making her feel invisible. Near the dining room, Hazel overheard two older women whispering quietly. "Do you think Dalton's finally leaving her? I heard there's someone else." Well, honestly, Vivian never liked Hazel anyway. Hazel kept walking without reacting, but each sentence lodged deeper into her chest. Humiliation had layers. The affair itself hurt, but realizing people had been discussing the collapse of her marriage while smiling to her face, that was a different kind of cruelty. By evening, Hazel felt emotionally flayed open. She escaped briefly onto the back terrace for air. Snow covered the massive backyard in untouched white, while soft music drifted from inside the mansion. For a few peaceful seconds, she stood alone. Then, Vivian appeared beside her, holding a champagne glass. "You disappeared." Hazel didn't turn around. "I needed air." Vivian leaned lightly against the railing. "You know," she said calmly, "this family has sacrificed quite a bit trying to make you comfortable." Hazel stared into the snow. That sentence almost made her laugh out loud. Comfortable, as if surviving constant criticism was comfort. As if shrinking herself was privilege. "I gave up my career for Dalton," Hazel said quietly. Vivian sipped champagne. "That was your choice. I moved cities for him. Again. Your choice." Hazel finally turned toward her. "I spent years trying to earn your approval." Vivian's eyes were completely emotionless. "That was your first mistake." Silence fell between them. Cold winter wind moved through Hazel's hair, and suddenly, terrifyingly, the grief started transforming into anger. Real anger. Not emotional panic, not wounded sadness. Something steadier. "How long have you known?" Hazel asked softly. Vivian's gaze sharpened instantly. "I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do." For the first time, Vivian looked cautious. Hazel stepped closer. "Savannah." Neither woman spoke. That silence confirmed everything. Hazel actually felt her heart harden in that moment. Because Dalton betraying her was devastating, but Vivian helping him do it? That was monstrous. Finally, Vivian exhaled softly. "Dalton deserves happiness." Hazel stared at her in disbelief. "So you encouraged this?" Vivian's expression remained calm. "I encouraged my son not to waste his life settling." The cruelty of that sentence sliced through Hazel so deeply she physically felt it. Settling. After everything she sacrificed. Everything she built beside him. Everything she endured for that family. Vivian still believed Hazel was beneath them. "You know what's funny," Hazel whispered. Vivian raised an eyebrow. "For years, I thought if I loved Dalton enough, your family would eventually love me too." Vivian almost looked amused. That was naive. Hazel nodded slowly. "Yes, it was." The mansion doors opened behind them. Dalton stepped outside, looking tense. "There you are," he said, glancing between them carefully. Hazel noticed it immediately. The nervousness, the calculation, like he was constantly managing landmines now. Vivian touched Dalton's arm gently. "Your wife and I were just talking." Hazel almost laughed at the absurdity. Talking, as if emotional warfare deserved softer language. Dalton looked at Hazel carefully. "You okay?" Again. That question, always after damage was already done. Hazel held his gaze for several long seconds. For the first time in years, she saw him clearly. Not the man she married, not the man she defended. Just a weak man, terrified of disappointing his mother more than losing his wife. And suddenly, Dalton looked smaller. Vivian adjusted her champagne glass elegantly. "Remember, Hazel," she said smoothly. "Christmas dinner is important for the family this year." Hazel's eyes narrowed slightly. Vivian stepped closer and lowered her voice just enough. "Don't embarrass us." Then she walked back inside the mansion, leaving Hazel standing in the snow beside the husband who still said nothing. Absolutely nothing. Hazel waited 4 days before calling Naomi Bennett. 4 days of pretending nothing was wrong. 4 days of sleeping beside a man who whispered goodnight after texting another woman. 4 days of smiling through Christmas events while Vivian treated her like disposable furniture. By the time Hazel finally made the call, something inside her had changed permanently. Not healed, not stronger, just done. Naomi answered on the second ring. "Hazel Foster," she said warmly. "I was starting to think Manhattan swallowed you alive." For the first time in weeks, Hazel almost smiled. Naomi had been her closest friend in college before life scattered them in different directions. While Hazel pursued architecture in Chicago, Naomi had gone to Columbia Law and eventually built a reputation as one of Manhattan's sharpest divorce attorneys. They used to joke that Naomi could smell lies before people finished speaking them. Now Hazel wondered if Naomi would smell the destruction all over her immediately. "I need to see you," Hazel said quietly. There was a pause. Not awkward. Concerned. "Tomorrow," Naomi replied instantly. "Lunch. Midtown." The next afternoon, Hazel sat across from Naomi inside an upscale Italian restaurant overlooking Fifth Avenue, while snow drifted past the windows outside. Naomi looked almost exactly the same. Sharp, dark hair, perfect posture, intelligent eyes that missed absolutely nothing. But unlike the polished cruelty of women like Vivian, Naomi's sharpness felt protective, grounded, human. The moment Hazel sat down, Naomi studied her face carefully. "Oh, sweetheart," she said softly. And just like that, Hazel nearly cried, because kindness felt unbearable after months of emotional starvation. "I look that bad." Hazel tried joking, weakly. Naomi leaned back slowly. "You look exhausted." Hazel stared down at her untouched coffee. For several moments, she couldn't speak, because saying things out loud made them real. Finally, she whispered Dalton's having an affair. Naomi didn't react dramatically, didn't gasp, didn't pretend shock. Instead, she asked quietly, "How long have you known a week? And how long has it actually been happening?" Hazel swallowed hard. "I don't know." Naomi nodded slowly, like someone mentally organizing pieces of a puzzle. "Tell me everything." So Hazel did. The hotel receipt, the messages, Savannah, Vivian, the years of humiliation, the loneliness, the gaslighting, the gradual erosion of her self-worth until she barely recognized herself anymore. And the strangest part. Once Hazel started talking, she couldn't stop. It all poured out of her like floodwater, finally breaking through a cracked dam. By the end, her coffee sat cold and untouched between her shaking hands. Naomi remained silent for several seconds afterward. Then she asked one devastating question. "Why are you the only person fighting for your marriage?" Hazel froze. Because no one had ever phrased it that way before. Not even herself. She started weakly, then stopped. Naomi leaned forward slightly. "Hazel, listen to me carefully. Loving someone should not require destroying yourself." The words hit hard. Too hard. Hazel looked away quickly, blinking against sudden tears. "I kept thinking if I tried harder." "No." Naomi's voice cut through the sentence firmly. "This isn't happening because you failed. It's happening because Dalton got comfortable benefiting from your loyalty." Hazel stared silently at the tablecloth. Naomi softened slightly. "Do you know what emotional abuse does to intelligent women?" Hazel shook her head faintly. It teaches them to over-explain pain that should simply be unacceptable. The truth of that nearly stole Hazel's breath, because she had spent years rationalizing cruelty, Dalton's neglect, Vivian's humiliation, the affair, all of it, always trying to understand instead of asking the more important question, why was she tolerating it? Naomi reached for her wine glass. Tell me about finances. Hazel frowned slightly. What money? Assets? Property? Investments? Hazel blinked. I don't really handle those things. Dalton manages most of it. Naomi stared at her in disbelief. Hazel. The way she said her name made Hazel immediately feel stupid. I trusted him, Hazel whispered. Naomi sighed softly. Of course you did. Then her expression sharpened. Which means we start there. Over the next hour, Naomi asked question after question while mentally constructing the skeleton of Hazel's marriage. Joint accounts, business holdings, properties, trusts, insurance policies, retirement funds. The deeper they went, the more uneasy Naomi became. Finally, she sat back slowly. There are gaps. Hazel frowned. What kind of gaps? Naomi tapped manicured fingers lightly against the table. Dalton's compensation package should reflect significantly higher liquidity than what appears in your shared financial disclosures. Hazel stared blankly. You lost me. Naomi gave a humorless smile. I think your husband may be hiding money. The words landed like ice water. No, Hazel said automatically. Dalton wouldn't. Then she stopped herself, because apparently Dalton absolutely would. Naomi watched realization spread across Hazel's face. Men who cheat often prepare financially before leaving marriages, Naomi explained carefully. Especially wealthy men. Hazel felt physically sick. You think he's planning to leave me? Naomi's silence answered loudly enough. Hazel looked down at her trembling hands. All this time, she thought she was trying to save her marriage. Meanwhile, Dalton might have already been preparing to erase her from his life entirely. The humiliation of that was unbearable. Naomi opened her leather folder calmly. Did you bring the evidence? Hazel nodded and handed over printed screenshots, hotel receipts, and financial statements she barely understood. Naomi reviewed everything carefully. The more she read, the colder her expression became. Well, she muttered finally. Your husband's an idiot. Hazel blinked. What? Naomi slid one receipt toward her. He used company expense accounts for personal travel. Hazel stared. And if he's sleeping with an employee while misusing company funds, this becomes much bigger than infidelity. Something shifted inside Hazel then. For the first time since discovering the affair, she saw fear flicker somewhere beyond the pain. Not her fear, Dalton's. Naomi closed the folder slowly. Hazel, has Dalton ever made you feel like you'd have nothing without him? Hazel hesitated. Yes. Naomi nodded grimly. They always do. The restaurant suddenly felt too warm, too loud. Hazel pressed trembling fingers against her temple. I don't even know who I am anymore. Naomi's face softened again. That's what emotional manipulation does. It slowly disconnects you from yourself. Hazel laughed bitterly. I used to be ambitious. You still are. I used to feel strong. You still are. Hazel shook her head weakly. You don't understand. I let this happen for years. Naomi leaned forward firmly. No. He chose to betray you for years. Those are not the same thing. Silence stretched between them. Then Naomi said something Hazel would replay in her mind for months afterward. They think you're weak because you stayed quiet. Hazel looked up slowly, and maybe Naomi continued calmly. That's the biggest mistake they're about to make. For the first time in weeks, something unfamiliar flickered inside Hazel. Not revenge. Not yet. Something quieter. Awareness. Naomi gathered the documents carefully. Do not confront Dalton. Hazel frowned immediately. What? Not yet. Why? Because people like Dalton and Vivian survive by controlling narratives. Naomi's eyes hardened. If you confront them emotionally now, they'll manipulate the situation before you're prepared. Hazel stared at her. So what do I do? Naomi smiled slightly. For now, she closed the folder. Let them perform. That evening, Hazel returned to the Connecticut house just after sunset. The Christmas lights glowing across the mansion suddenly looked grotesque, artificial, like everything else in her marriage. Inside, Dalton stood in the kitchen pouring bourbon. He smiled casually when he saw her. There you are? Hazel looked at him carefully. Really carefully. This man had shared her bed while preparing to betray her financially, emotionally, publicly. And somehow he still looked comfortable, relaxed, certain she'd never leave. How was the city, he asked. Hazel removed her coat slowly. Educational. Dalton laughed lightly, not understanding the weight behind the word. Then his phone buzzed again. Hazel watched him glance down instinctively and smile. Again. That tiny smile finally stopped hurting. Because for the first time, Hazel wasn't looking at the woman Dalton loved. She was looking at the man he truly was. By Christmas Eve, Hazel felt like an actress inside her own marriage. Every smile was rehearsed, every conversation carefully controlled, every breath measured. And somehow that terrified Dalton more than tears ever could. The Whitmore mansion glowed like a luxury postcard beneath fresh Connecticut snow. Golden lights wrapped around towering pine trees outside, while valets guided sleek black cars up the circular driveway, one after another. Inside the house was overflowing with wealth. Crystal chandeliers, fresh white roses, live violin music drifting through the halls, caterers in black uniforms carrying trays of champagne beneath ceilings taller than most apartments. Everything looked beautiful, which made the ugliness underneath even harder to stomach. Hazel stood upstairs in front of the bathroom mirror, fastening diamond earrings slowly. The woman staring back at her looked elegant, composed, cold almost. Her deep emerald silk dress hugged her figure perfectly while soft curls framed her face. Vivian had once told her green was the only color that made her look appropriately expensive. Tonight, Hazel wore it intentionally. Not to please Vivian, to remind herself she still knew how to survive among predators. A knock sounded at the bathroom door. Dalton. "You almost ready?" he asked. Hazel opened the door calmly. For half a second, Dalton visibly froze. His eyes traveled across her face, her dress, her posture. And Hazel noticed something she hadn't seen in months. Attention. Real attention. "You look..." Dalton cleared his throat slightly. "Beautiful." The compliment irritated her more than it should have, because now he noticed her. After another woman, after years of emotional neglect. Still, Hazel smiled faintly. "Thank you." Dalton studied her carefully. "You seem different lately." Hazel slipped past him into the hallway. "Maybe I'm tired of being predictable." His expression tightened slightly. Good. Let him feel uncertain for once. Downstairs, the mansion buzzed with elite East Coast energy. Politicians, investors, old money families, and corporate executives filled the enormous living room while soft jazz played near the grand piano. Hazel moved through the crowd gracefully beside Dalton, accepting compliments and holiday greetings like nothing in her life was collapsing. Years of surviving Vivian had trained her well. One of Dalton's business partners smiled warmly at Hazel near the bar. "Haven't seen enough of you lately," he said. Still designing. Before Hazel could answer, Dalton spoke casually. She stepped back from architecture for a while. Stepped back. Such a clean, polished way to describe sacrificing her career for his ambitions. The partner nodded politely. "Well, shame. Dalton always said you were brilliant." Hazel glanced sideways at her husband. "Funny. Dalton used to say that. before brilliance became inconvenient, before confidence threatened the fragile ego of a man who needed admiration more than partnership. "I'm considering returning," Hazel answered calmly. Dalton looked surprised. "Oh," Hazel sipped champagne. "Why not?" Something flickered across his face. Discomfort. Again. And Hazel realized he genuinely hadn't expected her to rebuild a life outside him. That realization made her strangely calmer. Across the room, Vivian descended the staircase like royalty entering her kingdom. Conversation subtly shifted around her instantly. That was the thing about Vivian Whitmore. People didn't merely notice her. They adjusted themselves around her. Vivian kissed cheeks elegantly as guests greeted her. Her silver gown shimmered beneath the chandelier lights while diamonds glittered at her throat. Then her eyes landed on Hazel. A pause. Quick, but unmistakable. Vivian was assessing her, measuring her, trying to understand why Hazel no longer looked wounded. "You finally made an effort tonight," Vivian commented smoothly when she approached. Dalton sighed softly. "Mom, what?" Vivian smiled innocently. "Hazel looks lovely." Compliments from Vivian always felt like hidden insults wrapped in silk. "Thank you," Hazel replied evenly. Vivian's gaze sharpened slightly at Hazel's calm tone. Interesting. She noticed the difference too. A server approached with fresh champagne. Vivian lifted her glass elegantly. "This Christmas matters," she said lightly. "There are several important people here tonight." Hazel smiled faintly. "There always are." Vivian studied her carefully for another moment before drifting toward other guests. Dalton exhaled quietly beside Hazel. "You know how she is." Hazel almost laughed. That sentence had become the soundtrack of her marriage. "You know how she is." Translation. "Accept the disrespect quietly so I don't have to confront it." "I do know how she is," Hazel answered softly. Dalton frowned slightly at her tone. Before he could respond, movement near the front entrance caught Hazel's attention. And suddenly, there she was, Savannah Reed. For one surreal second, the entire room seemed to tilt sideways. Savannah was younger than Hazel expected, late 20s, blonde, beautiful in a polished, social media perfect kind of way. She wore a fitted cream dress and carried herself with the easy confidence of someone who believed she belonged there. Which meant Dalton had clearly been feeding her promises. Hazel watched Dalton's body tense instantly beside her. Tiny reaction, but obvious once you knew what to look for. Savannah Vivian called warmly across the room. Warmly. God. The humiliation of that nearly took Hazel's breath away. Savannah approached with a bright smile. "Mrs. Whitmore, thank you again for inviting me." Vivian touched Savannah's arm affectionately. "Nonsense. You're practically family after how hard you work for Dalton." Practically family. The cruelty was almost theatrical now. Hazel looked directly at Dalton. He wouldn't meet her eyes. Coward. Savannah finally turned toward Hazel politely. "Oh, Hazel. Hi." The awkwardness in her voice revealed something important. Savannah expected Hazel to remain clueless. "Interesting." Hazel smiled pleasantly. "Savannah, nice to finally meet you properly." Dalton looked like he might physically stop breathing. Vivian's eyes narrowed slightly. Only Hazel remained calm. Savannah recovered quickly. "You too," she answered carefully. Up close, Hazel could see the expensive bracelet on Savannah's wrist, the one Dalton bought last month, claiming it was a client gift expense. The memory almost made Hazel dizzy. Still, she kept smiling, because Naomi was right. Let them perform. Throughout the evening, Hazel observed everything quietly. Savannah lingering near Dalton too often. Dalton instinctively moving toward her in crowded rooms. The private glances, the subtle touches, the chemistry they clearly thought nobody noticed. But Hazel noticed now. Every single thing. At one point near the dining room, she overheard Savannah laughing softly while Dalton whispered something in her ear. The intimacy of it burned, not because Hazel still wanted him, but because of how disrespectful it was, how careless, how arrogant. They truly believed she would never leave. Later dinner preparations began in the massive formal dining hall. Staff adjusted gold place cards while guests found assigned seating beneath candlelight and elaborate Christmas centerpieces. Hazel noticed immediately where Savannah was seated, directly across from Dalton, and suspiciously close to Vivian. Of course. Hazel pulled out her chair slowly. Vivian raised her champagne glass from the opposite end of the table. "I do hope tomorrow night's Christmas dinner will be memorable," she announced elegantly. Guests smiled politely. Vivian's eyes drifted toward Hazel. "I've actually prepared a very special family toast." Something dangerous flickered beneath her smile. Hazel recognized it instantly. Vivian was planning something public, cruel, calculated. Dalton seemed uncomfortable too. Good. Hazel lifted her own champagne glass slowly. "Well," she said softly, meeting Vivian's gaze directly, "that's perfect." The entire table seemed to quiet slightly, because something in Hazel's voice sounded different now. Steadier, sharper. Vivian's smile faltered for half a second. Hazel took a slow sip of champagne. So did I. Christmas dinner began precisely at 7:30. Because in the Whitmore family, even emotions followed schedules. The formal dining room looked breathtaking beneath candlelight. Gold-rimmed china gleamed against deep emerald table runners, while crystal glasses reflected the soft glow of the chandelier overhead. To anyone outside the family, it probably looked perfect. A wealthy American Christmas. Elegant, refined, sophisticated. Hazel sat halfway down the enormous table beside Dalton, while laughter and polished conversation floated around them. But beneath the luxury tension coiled tightly in her chest, because she could feel it coming. Vivian's performance. Across the table, Savannah wore a soft smile, while pretending not to look at Dalton too often. She looked nervous tonight. Hazel noticed that immediately. Good. Maybe guilt existed somewhere underneath the expensive makeup and stolen affection after all. A server refilled wine glasses while guests complimented the meal loudly enough to impress one another. Dalton barely touched his food. He kept glancing at Hazel subtly, watching her, trying to read her. Hazel remained calm, almost eerily calm. That frightened him more than anger would have. Near the far end of the table, one of Dalton's uncles laughed loudly at a story, while Vivian smiled gracefully beside him. The perfect hostess, the perfect matriarch, the perfect manipulator. Hazel wondered how many people in this room actually knew who Vivian truly was. Probably very few. Cruel people rarely look cruel in public. That was their greatest weapon. Eventually, dessert arrived, and Hazel saw it happen. Vivian slowly lifted her champagne glass. The room quieted instinctively. Of course it did. Vivian Whitmore loved attention almost as much as she loved control. "My family," Vivian began warmly, her voice smooth and practiced. "Every Christmas, I like to reflect on gratitude." Soft smiles spread around the table. Hazel remained still. Vivian continued elegantly. "We've had another successful year. Dalton's company exceeded expectations. Our investments flourished. Our family name continues to stand strong." Dalton relaxed slightly beside Hazel. He thought this would remain harmless. Poor man. Vivian turned slowly toward Hazel. "And, of course," she said sweetly, "we're grateful for those who try their best to contribute." The first subtle sting. A few awkward chuckles moved across the table. Hazel saw Dalton tense instantly now. Too late. Vivian smiled at her daughter-in-law. Hazel has certainly tried. There it was. The beginning. Hazel folded her hands calmly in her lap. Vivian sighed dramatically. "You know, marriage into a family like ours isn't easy." Several guests shifted uncomfortably. But nobody interrupted her. Nobody ever interrupted Vivian. She came from such a different world, Vivian continued. Different values, different standards. Hazel felt dozens of eyes slowly drifting toward her. The humiliation started low in her stomach. Hot, sharp, familiar. Vivian tilted her head sympathetically, but we welcomed her anyway. Hazel almost laughed out loud. Welcomed. What an extraordinary rewrite of reality. Vivian sipped champagne delicately before continuing. And while Hazel never truly adapted to the responsibilities of this family, Dalton finally spoke quietly. Mom? Vivian ignored him completely. She did teach us all something important. The room had become painfully silent now. Hazel could practically hear her own heartbeat. Vivian smiled sadly. Kindness alone is not enough to sustain a marriage. There were a few uncomfortable glances exchanged around the table. Still, nobody stopped her. Hazel looked at Dalton, waiting. Just once. Defend me once. Vivian continued mercilessly. A wife should strengthen her husband, elevate him, inspire growth. Savannah stared down at her wine glass now. Even she looked uncomfortable. Interesting. Hazel's throat tightened painfully as Vivian's voice sharpened slightly. Instead, Dalton spent years carrying emotional burdens no man should have to carry alone. That one hit hard, because Hazel knew exactly what Vivian was implying. Her anxiety, her loneliness, her pain, all reframed as inconveniences to Dalton. Hazel felt her nails dig into her palm beneath the table. Vivian sighed dramatically again. And despite every opportunity, we still have no children, no legacy, no future generation. There it was, the cruelest wound. Hazel stopped breathing for a second, because Vivian knew. She knew Hazel had spent years quietly grieving infertility treatments that failed over and over again. Dalton had promised they would face it together. Instead, he let his mother weaponize it publicly. The shame burned through Hazel's body like acid. One of the women at the table whispered softly, "Vivian, maybe." But Vivian lifted her hand gracefully. No, no. I believe honesty matters during the holidays. Honesty. Hazel nearly choked on the hypocrisy. Vivian turned toward the guests again. So tonight, I'd like to toast Hazel. She smiled slowly. For surviving another year of disappointing this family. A few stunned laughs escaped automatically from guests, too shocked to react properly. Someone dropped a fork. The sound echoed sharply in the silence afterward. Hazel felt the entire world narrow into a single, unbearable moment. Humiliation, betrayal, grief, years of pain collapsing inward all at once. And beside her, Dalton stayed silent. Silent. Hazel turned toward him slowly. His jaw looked tight, embarrassed, but not angry enough, not protective enough, not loving enough. Say something, Hazel whispered. Dalton leaned slightly toward her. Mom's emotional tonight? Hazel stared at him in disbelief. That was it. That was all, 8 years together. And that was all he had to offer while his mother publicly destroyed her. Something inside Hazel finally snapped. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, like the final thread holding something together finally giving way. She suddenly remembered every moment she abandoned herself trying to keep this marriage alive. Every apology she gave when she wasn't wrong. Every humiliation she swallowed. Every dream she sacrificed. And for what? A man too weak to protect her from his mother. Hazel looked around the table slowly. Nobody could meet her eyes now. Not Dalton, not Savannah, not even Vivian. Interesting. Because cruel people loved public humiliation right up until the moment consequences appeared. Hazel inhaled slowly. Then she stood up. The movement instantly silenced the room completely. Crystal chandeliers glittered overhead while snow fell softly beyond the massive windows behind her. For a second, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Hazel picked up her champagne glass calmly and smiled. Not sadly, not emotionally. Something far more dangerous. Controlled. Vivian's expression shifted immediately. Confusion, then caution. Hazel looked directly at her mother-in-law. "Well," she said softly, her voice steady enough to terrify Dalton instantly, "that was an interesting list." Nobody moved. Hazel turned slightly toward the rest of the table. Although personally, she placed her champagne glass down carefully. "I think mine is longer." Dalton's face lost color immediately. "Hazel." She ignored him. Slowly, deliberately, Hazel reached down beside her chair and lifted her leather handbag onto the table. The sound alone felt deafening in the silence. Vivian's confident expression finally cracked slightly. Hazel opened the bag calmly, then pulled out a thick stack of papers. And suddenly, for the very first time that night, Vivian Whitmore stopped smiling. The silence inside the dining room became suffocating. Nobody reached for their wine. Nobody touched dessert. The only sound was the faint crackling of the fireplace somewhere beyond the doorway. Hazel stood calmly at the center of the destruction. And for the first time in 8 years, nobody in the Whitmore family knew how to control her. Dalton stared at the stack of papers in her hands like they were explosives. "Hazel," he said carefully, forcing a weak laugh. "Maybe this isn't the time." "Oh, I think it's the perfect time," Hazel interrupted softly. Vivian straightened slowly in her chair. "This has gone far enough." Hazel looked directly at her mother-in-law. "No," she replied evenly. "It hasn't gone nearly far enough." A visible ripple of discomfort moved across the table. Some guests looked horrified. Others looked fascinated. Upper-class families loved scandals as long as they weren't their own. Hazel glanced down at the first page calmly. "You made a list of my failures tonight," she said. "So I thought I'd finally acknowledge a few things I've spent years pretending not to see." Dalton's voice sharpened. "Hazel, stop." That almost made her smile. Interesting. Now he wanted boundaries, after years of letting his mother humiliate her publicly. Hazel ignored him. "Let's start small," she said lightly. She lifted one sheet of paper. "May 14th, 3 years ago. Vivian Whitmore told me at a charity gala that I was socially exhausting to defend." A few guests shifted awkwardly. Vivian rolled her eyes dismissively. "Oh, for God's sake." Hazel continued calmly. "December 21st, 4 years ago. Vivian informed me infertility was nature correcting a mismatch." Someone audibly gasped. Dalton closed his eyes briefly. "Good. Let him hear it. Let him finally sit inside the cruelty he protected." Vivian's expression hardened instantly. "You're being dramatic." Hazel laughed softly. No anger, no hysteria, just disbelief. "That's the thing about emotionally abusive people," Hazel said quietly. "They always call honesty dramatic once someone finally speaks." The room went dead silent again. Savannah looked increasingly panicked now. Hazel noticed. Interesting. Maybe the mistress never expected the wife to become dangerous. Hazel placed one paper down carefully. "Here's another one." She looked toward Dalton now. 8 years ago, I gave up a senior architecture position in Chicago because Dalton said moving to New York would be temporary." Dalton swallowed hard. Hazel continued. 6 years ago, I managed investor events for Whitmore Capital without salary because Dalton said we were building a future together." Her voice remained frighteningly steady. 3 years ago, I spent 6 weeks sleeping in a hospital chair caring for Vivian after surgery while Dalton attended conferences in Europe." Vivian scoffed. "Nobody forced you to do those things." Hazel nodded slowly. "You're right." The answer caught Vivian off guard. Hazel folded her hands lightly over the papers. "Nobody forced me. I loved people who never deserved the level of loyalty I gave them." That one landed hard. Even some guests looked ashamed now. Across the table, Dalton's uncle stared into his wine glass uncomfortably while one of Vivian's friends refused to make eye contact entirely. Because deep down, everyone here knew the truth. They had watched Hazel shrink for years, and nobody stopped it. Dalton finally stood up abruptly. That's enough. Hazel turned toward him calmly. Is it? Yes. No, Hazel said softly. Enough was years ago. Dalton lowered his voice. You're embarrassing yourself. The sentence hung in the air. Hazel almost pitied him, because even now, even after everything, he still believed public image mattered more than what he'd done to her. No, she answered quietly. I think you're finally seeing yourself clearly for the first time. Dalton's jaw tightened. Can we please do this privately? Hazel tilted her head slightly. Interesting, because humiliation seemed perfectly acceptable when I was the one suffering publicly. Vivian slammed her champagne glass onto the table. You are acting completely unstable. Hazel slowly looked at her and smiled. No, Vivian, she said softly. This is the most stable I've been in years. That unsettled Vivian visibly, because tears would have been easier. Anger would have been easier. But calm women were dangerous, especially women who no longer needed approval. Hazel reached into the folder again. Now, she continued. Let's discuss the affair. Savannah physically froze. Dalton went pale instantly. Hazel. December 3rd. Langford Hotel. Manhattan. Hazel lifted the receipt carefully. 1 king suite, paid through Whitmore Capital corporate expenses. A stunned murmur spread across the table. Dalton looked genuinely panicked now. That's not what it looks like. Hazel actually laughed. A real laugh this time. Sharp. Disbelieving. Do men ever hear themselves when they say that Savannah suddenly stood? I think I should leave. No. Vivian snapped immediately. Because Vivian still thought this could be controlled. Managed. Buried. Hazel looked directly at Savannah for the first time all evening. You knew he was married. Savannah looked visibly shaken now. Hazel's expression never changed. You sat in my home, ate at my table, smiled in my face. Savannah's eyes filled with tears instantly. Good. Let her feel something. Dalton stepped forward. This is between me and you. Hazel's gaze snapped toward him sharply. No, she said quietly. You lost the right to privacy when you turned my marriage into public humiliation. Then slowly, Hazel pulled several printed photographs from the folder. The entire room stiffened. Dalton whispered, "Oh my God!" Hazel laid the photos gently across the white tablecloth. Dalton kissing Savannah outside a hotel. Dalton holding her waist in Manhattan. Savannah sitting on Dalton's lap inside a private restaurant booth. Every image crystal clear, every lie exposed. Someone near the end of the table muttered, Jesus Christ. Vivian looked physically furious now. Not at Dalton, at Hazel. How dare you bring this into my home? That sentence finally shattered the last illusion Hazel ever had about her mother-in-law. Not how dare Dalton betray his wife. Not how dare this happen. Only concern for appearances. Hazel looked directly into Vivian's eyes. Your son cheated on his wife, she said calmly. And somehow, I'm still the one embarrassing the family. Vivian stood abruptly. You ungrateful little… No, Hazel, interrupted quietly. The softness in her voice somehow silenced the entire room instantly. No more. And suddenly something terrifying happened. Hazel realized she wasn't afraid anymore. Not of Vivian, not of Dalton leaving, not of being alone, because the worst thing had already happened. She gave her entire heart to people who treated it like weakness. Nothing could hurt more than that realization. Dalton ran a hand through his hair desperately. Hazel, please, let's talk upstairs. She looked at him for several long seconds. This man had once been her safest place. Now she looked at him and saw a stranger wearing her husband's face. "I begged for emotional honesty for years," she said quietly. "You only want honesty now because you got caught." Dalton's face crumpled slightly, and for one tiny second he actually looked ashamed. But it was too late. Years too late. Hazel gathered the remaining papers slowly. Then she looked around the table one final time. At some point, she said softly, "You all confused my kindness with weakness." Nobody spoke. Nobody could. Hazel glanced once more toward Vivian, then Dalton, then Savannah. And finally, with terrifying calm, she said, "But the thing about quiet women is—" She closed the folder slowly. "You never notice how much they're surviving until they stop surviving silently. Nobody knew what to do after that." The Whitmore Christmas dinner had transformed from elegant holiday tradition into open, emotional warfare, and every person sitting at that table understood they were witnessing something irreversible. Hazel remained standing calmly beside her chair. Dalton looked shattered. Vivian looked furious, and Savannah looked terrified. The photos still lay scattered across the white tablecloth like evidence at a crime scene. No one touched them. No one dared. Finally, Dalton spoke first. "Everybody needs to calm down." The sentence was so absurd, Hazel almost smiled. Calm down. As if this situation still belonged inside normal emotional boundaries. Vivian recovered quickly, straightening her posture with practiced aristocratic control. "This conversation is over," she announced sharply. Hazel raised an eyebrow. "Oh, it wasn't over when I was being humiliated." Vivian's jaw tightened. That was family discussion. Hazel stared at her in disbelief. "No," she said softly. "That was emotional abuse with champagne." A few guests visibly winced. Good. Let them feel uncomfortable. Comfort was what allowed cruel people to continue behaving this way unchecked. Dalton stepped closer to Hazel, carefully lowering his voice. "You've made your point." Hazel looked at him slowly. "My point." Her laugh was quiet and dangerous. "You think this was about making a point?" Dalton rubbed a hand across his face. "Please stop doing this here." "Interesting," Hazel replied calmly. "Because you had no problem betraying me here." Savannah suddenly pushed back her chair. "I'm leaving." "No," Vivian snapped again. This time sharper, panicked, because Vivian understood something Dalton still didn't. The moment Savannah started talking, the entire carefully constructed Whitmore image could collapse. Savannah looked close to tears now. "I didn't sign up for this." Hazel's eyes moved toward her slowly. "No," Savannah swallowed hard. "You told me your marriage was basically over." The room froze instantly. Dalton's face drained of color. "Savannah," he warned quietly. But it was too late. Hazel felt something strange inside her chest. Not heartbreak anymore. Not even anger. Just confirmation. Savannah looked directly at Hazel, now emotional and defensive all at once. "He said you two barely spoke. He said you checked out years ago." Dalton's voice sharpened instantly. "Stop talking." Savannah turned toward him in disbelief. "Oh, now you want honesty?" Hazel almost pitied her then. Almost. Because for the first time, Savannah was realizing she had never been special either. Just useful. Vivian stood abruptly. "This is disgraceful." Hazel looked at her coldly. "Yes, it is." Savannah shook her head emotionally. "He told me you stayed because of the money." That one almost made Hazel laugh out loud. Money. The irony was unbelievable. Hazel had sacrificed a thriving architecture career for Dalton while he secretly convinced another woman she was some kind of gold digger. Dalton looked furious now. "Savannah, enough." "No." Savannah snapped suddenly. Her voice cracked with humiliation. "No, actually, I'm done protecting you." Interesting. The affair was collapsing in real time. Savannah wiped quickly beneath her eyes. You promised me this would be over after Christmas. Several guests exchanged horrified glances immediately. Hazel noticed Vivian physically stiffen. Dalton whispered harshly, "Stop!" Savannah laughed bitterly through tears. "You told me Hazel was weak, that she'd never leave you." That sentence hit the room like shattered glass, because deep down, everyone knew it was true. Dalton truly believed Hazel would tolerate anything. Years of silence had taught him that. Hazel looked directly at her husband, and for the first time since the affair exploded publicly, Dalton looked afraid of her. Real fear, not fear of losing the marriage, fear of losing control of the narrative. Savannah's breathing became uneven, now emotions spilling out too fast to stop. "You said the penthouse would be ready by spring." Hazel blinked slowly. "Penthouse? Interesting." Savannah kept going. "You said once the divorce happened, we'd finally stop hiding." Dalton moved toward her immediately. "Savannah, enough." But Savannah jerked away from him. "No, you don't get to make me look crazy now." Hazel folded her arms quietly. The mistress was finally discovering what wives often learned too late. Men who lie comfortably to one woman eventually lie comfortably to another. Savannah laughed shakily. "You told me Hazel was emotionally unstable." That one almost amused Hazel, because emotionally manipulative men loved assigning instability to women reacting normally to betrayal. Vivian suddenly stepped forward. "You need to leave immediately." Savannah looked stunned. "Excuse me?" Vivian's face had turned ice cold. "You've embarrassed this family enough." Hazel stared at her mother-in-law in disbelief. Even now, Vivian blamed the woman with the least power in the room instead of the son who caused everything. Savannah looked between Dalton and Vivian slowly. Then realization hit her face all at once. "Oh my God!" Her voice broke. "You're throwing me under the bus." Dalton looked exhausted. "Savannah? No." Savannah backed away emotionally. "You both knew exactly what this was." Hazel noticed the shift immediately. Savannah finally understood she had never been entering the Whitmore family. She had simply been a temporary escape Dalton enjoyed while still keeping his respectable marriage intact. The humiliation on her face almost mirrored Hazel's own weeks earlier. Except Hazel had no sympathy left to give. Not tonight. One of Dalton's business partners stood abruptly from the table. "I think my wife and I should go." Others immediately began shifting uncomfortably too. The social collapse had started. Whitmore scandals would spread through Connecticut elite circles before midnight. Vivian clearly realized it too. Her entire body radiated fury now. "You've destroyed Christmas," she hissed toward Hazel. That sentence finally snapped something loose inside Hazel completely. Destroyed Christmas, not Dalton cheating, not Vivian humiliating her publicly. No. Hazel exposing the truth was apparently the real crime. Hazel smiled, slowly. "No," she said softly. "I think I just stopped protecting everyone else from the consequences of their behavior." Dalton looked exhausted beyond words. "Hazel, can we please talk privately?" She looked at him calmly. "There's nothing left to discuss privately." His face tightened painfully. "You're really doing this?" Hazel stared at him for several long seconds. And suddenly she realized something devastating. Dalton genuinely believed she still wouldn't leave. Even after all this. Even after the affair. Even after the humiliation. Some part of him still thought she'd calm down eventually and return to surviving quietly beside him. That realization made her feel almost numb. Slowly, Hazel reached back into her leather folder. Then she placed another envelope carefully onto the table in front of Dalton. His expression changed instantly. "What's this?" Hazel's voice remained calm enough to terrify him. "Reality." Dalton opened the envelope slowly. The moment he saw the papers inside, all the color disappeared from his face. Divorce documents. Prepared. Signed. Official. The room fell completely silent again. Vivian stepped closer immediately. What is this? Hazel looked directly at Dalton. You spent years assuming I'd never leave, she said quietly. Dalton stared at the papers in shock. Hazel's eyes hardened for the first time all evening. That was your biggest mistake. Then she delivered the sentence that finally shattered whatever confidence remained in him. And before anyone here starts worrying about protecting Whitmore money, Hazel folded her hands calmly. You should know Naomi Bennett already found the hidden accounts. Dalton stopped breathing. Completely. Hazel saw the panic hit him instantly. Real panic this time. Not emotional discomfort. Fear. And suddenly Hazel understood something powerful. The balance of power had finally changed. Dalton stared at the divorce papers like they were written in another language. For several long seconds he didn't move, didn't blink, didn't speak. The arrogant certainty Hazel had watched him carry for years was finally cracking in front of her eyes. And somehow that felt less satisfying than she imagined it would. Because once you truly stop loving someone, watching them panic stops feeling powerful. It just feels sad. What the hell is this? Dalton asked finally, his voice low and unsteady. Hazel remained calm. Divorce papers. Vivian stepped forward immediately. This is insane. Hazel turned toward her slowly. No, she replied softly. Staying here another year would have been an eye. Several guests were quietly gathering coats now near the edge of the dining room, pretending not to stare while absolutely staring. The scandal had already escaped containment. By morning, half of Connecticut's wealthy social circles would know exactly what happened at Whitmore Christmas dinner. And for once, Hazel didn't care. Dalton flipped through the papers rapidly. The deeper he read, the paler he became. This is ridiculous, he snapped suddenly. You hired a lawyer without even talking to me. Hazel laughed softly in disbelief. You had an affair without talking to me. That shut him up immediately. Savannah stood near the doorway, now clutching her purse tightly like she wanted to disappear entirely. Vivian, however, remained laser-focused on damage control. Hazel, she said sharply, lowering her voice. Whatever emotional episode this is, we can handle it privately. Emotional episode. There it was again. The family's favorite way to minimize women once they became inconvenient. Hazel looked directly into Vivian's eyes. You know what's interesting? She said quietly. Vivian folded her arms. What? For years, every time I reacted normally to cruelty, this family called me emotional. Dalton ran both hands through his hair aggressively. Can we stop doing this in front of everyone? Hazel's expression hardened slightly. You still think public embarrassment is the problem here? Dalton slammed the papers down onto the table. You blindsided me. That one almost made her laugh. Blindsided. As if betrayal belonged exclusively to him now. Hazel stepped closer slowly. No, Dalton, she said quietly. I discovered your affair, your lies, your hidden accounts, and your plans to replace me during Christmas week. Her voice sharpened for the first time all night. That's being blindsided. The room fell silent again. Dalton's breathing looked uneven now. Good. Let him feel unstable for once. Hazel spent years emotionally drowning while he slept peacefully beside her. Vivian suddenly pointed toward the paperwork. You're not entitled to Whitmore assets. Hazel almost smiled. There it was. Not heartbreak. Not concern for the marriage. Money. Always money. Actually, Hazel answered calmly according to New York law and several very expensive attorneys. I am. Dalton's face darkened instantly. You went through our finances. Our finances, Hazel repeated quietly. Interesting choice of words considering how many accounts you forgot to mention. Vivian looked sharply toward Dalton now. What accounts? For the first time that evening, Dalton looked trapped from every direction. And Hazel realized something else important. Vivian clearly didn't know everything, which meant Dalton had been lying to everyone, not just her. Hazel folded her arms. Would you like me to explain the offshore transfers too? Dalton's eyes widened immediately. Hazel. Warning, panic, fear, all finally visible. Hazel felt oddly detached, watching it happen, like she was observing the collapse of someone else's marriage, instead of her own. A loud knock suddenly echoed through the mansion. Everyone froze. One of the household staff hurried toward the front entrance. A few seconds later, footsteps approached the dining room. Then Naomi Bennett walked in, wearing a long black wool coat dusted with snow. The timing was so precise, it almost felt cinematic. Vivian looked horrified instantly. Who is this? Naomi removed her gloves calmly. Naomi Bennett, counsel for Hazel Foster Whitmore. The room practically vibrated with tension. Dalton stared at Hazel in disbelief. You brought your lawyer to Christmas dinner. Hazel's expression remained perfectly composed. You brought your mistress. One of the guests actually choked on champagne. Naomi stepped beside Hazel smoothly. Her confidence filled the room immediately. Professional, controlled, dangerous. She placed another folder gently onto the table. Dalton looked genuinely sick now. What's this? Naomi smiled politely. Preliminary documentation regarding financial misconduct tied to Whitmore Capital. Vivian's face lost color. What? Naomi opened the folder calmly. Misuse of company accounts. Undisclosed transfers. Corporate-funded personal travel. Savannah looked ready to faint. Dalton's voice dropped dangerously low. You have no idea what you're talking about. Naomi's smile never changed. I assure you, Mr. Whitmore, I do. Hazel watched Dalton carefully. For years, he always looked composed, untouchable. Now sweat glistened faintly near his temple. Interesting. Naomi continued evenly. My client was prepared to settle privately. Vivian looked furious. Prepared. Naomi glanced toward Hazel warmly. Yes, before she was publicly humiliated tonight. That sentence landed heavily, because suddenly the room understood something clearly. Hazel didn't create this disaster. The Whitmores did. Dalton turned toward Hazel desperately. You were planning this? Hazel looked at him quietly. No. And for the first time all evening, emotion flickered visibly across her face. Pain. Real pain. I was planning to leave quietly. Dalton froze. Hazel swallowed hard. But then your mother decided to list my failures in front of a room full of strangers. Her eyes glistened slightly now, though her voice remained steady. So I figured honesty deserved an audience too. Even Naomi looked at Hazel softly then, because beneath all the revenge and exposure and rage, there was still grief. Years of it. Dalton stepped closer. Hazel, please. The desperation in his voice sounded real now. Finally, real. Too late. You can't do this, he whispered. Hazel stared at him for several long seconds. Then she asked the question that destroyed him. Why? Dalton blinked. What? Why can't I silence? Hazel tilted her head slightly. You cheated on me. Nothing. You lied to me. Nothing. You let your mother humiliate me for years. Still nothing. Hazel's voice dropped lower. So tell me, Dalton. Her eyes locked onto his. Why exactly do you believe I should stay? The silence afterward was unbearable, because he had no answer. None. Not one reason rooted in love. Only comfort, convenience, control. Vivian suddenly looked toward Naomi sharply. This conversation ends now. Naomi smiled politely. Unfortunately, Mrs. Whitmore federal financial investigations don't usually end because dinner became uncomfortable. That sentence hit Dalton like a gunshot. What investigation? Naomi slid another document across the table. Emergency board notification. Dalton grabbed it instantly. His face went completely white. Hazel watched realization crash through him in real time. The board knew, or at least suspected, enough. And suddenly, for the very first time since this marriage began falling apart, Dalton. Whitmore looked truly afraid, not of losing Hazel, not even of public humiliation. He looked afraid of losing power, and Hazel finally understood something terrifying. He should have been afraid of losing her years ago. The mansion emptied quickly after that. Not dramatically, not loudly. That was the thing about wealthy people. They preferred quiet exits from public disasters. One by one, guests gathered coats, murmured uncomfortable goodbyes, and disappeared into the snowy Connecticut night, pretending they hadn't just witnessed the collapse of the Whitmore family in real time. But Hazel saw the truth in their faces. Shock, curiosity, satisfaction. By sunrise, every country club, charity board, and executive office from Manhattan to Greenwich would know what happened at Christmas dinner. And for the first time in years, Hazel wasn't the one ashamed. Near the front entrance, Savannah hurried toward the door with tears streaking her makeup. Dalton caught her arm halfway there. "Savannah, wait." Hazel watched from the dining room silently. Interesting. Even now, he still wanted to manage both women. Savannah jerked away from him immediately. "Don't touch me." Her voice cracked loudly through the foyer. "You lied to me too." Dalton lowered his voice urgently. "Please stop making this worse." Savannah laughed bitterly. "Worse?" She looked toward the dining room where Hazel stood beside Naomi. "You told me Hazel was weak." That sentence hit Dalton visibly. "You said she'd never leave you." Hazel saw it clearly then. The affair had never been about love. It was about ego. Dalton wanted admiration without consequences, comfort without accountability, excitement without sacrifice. And men like that always believed loyal women would stay forever. Savannah shook her head in disbelief. "You used me." Dalton looked exhausted. "No, I didn't. You promised me a future." Silence, because he had. And now everyone knew it. Savannah wiped at her tears angrily. "You know what's pathetic," she snapped. "You don't even love anybody. You just love being worshipped." Then she walked out into the snow without looking back. Dalton stood frozen in the foyer while the front door closed behind her. For the first time in 8 years, Hazel saw him completely alone. And somehow, that loneliness suited him. Behind Hazel, Vivian suddenly exploded. "This cannot leave this house." Naomi almost smiled. "I'm afraid it already has." Vivian turned sharply. "You think you're clever." "No," Naomi replied calmly. "I think your family underestimated the woman you spent years humiliating." Vivian looked ready to shatter crystal with her bare hands. Hazel watched her quietly. All these years, Vivian controlled every room through intimidation and image management. Now neither was working, because truth was finally louder than status. Dalton slowly walked back into the dining room. He looked wrecked already. Tie loosened, eyes bloodshot, face pale beneath the chandelier lights. Hazel almost didn't recognize him. "Can we talk alone?" he asked quietly. Naomi immediately stepped forward slightly. Hazel raised a hand gently. "It's okay." Naomi studied her carefully. "You sure?" Hazel nodded once. Naomi gathered her files calmly. "I'll be in the library." Then she left the room, leaving Hazel alone with Dalton and Vivian. The silence afterward felt heavy enough to crush bone. Dalton stared at Hazel for several long seconds before speaking. "You planned all this?" Hazel looked at him calmly. "No." "Yes, you did." "No." Hazel repeated softly. "I planned to survive it." That answer visibly hit him. Dalton rubbed both hands across his face. "You could have talked to me." Hazel almost laughed. The hypocrisy was unbelievable. You had another woman in hotel rooms while I was decorating your family's Christmas table. Her voice remained quiet, steady. That wasn't exactly creating a safe environment for communication. Dalton flinched slightly. Good. Vivian suddenly interrupted sharply. We need to focus on fixing this. Hazel turned slowly toward her mother-in-law. Fixing this. Not apologizing. Not acknowledging harm. Only damage control. Hazel smiled faintly. You still think the problem is exposure. Vivian folded her arms. The problem is you publicly humiliating this family. Hazel stared at her in disbelief. Your son cheated on his wife and hid money. Vivian's voice rose immediately. And you destroyed Christmas dinner. That finally did it. Hazel laughed, a real laugh this time. Not bitter, not angry, just stunned by the absurdity. Vivian looked furious. What's so funny? Hazel shook her head slowly. I spent years thinking your cruelty had depth. Vivian narrowed her eyes. What does that mean? It means, Hazel replied softly, I kept searching for humanity underneath your behavior. The silence afterward felt razor sharp, but there isn't any, Hazel finished quietly. For once, Vivian had no immediate response. Dalton suddenly stepped closer. Hazel, please. Something in his voice sounded different now. Not manipulative, scared, real fear. And Hazel realized he was finally understanding something important. She was actually leaving, not threatening, not emotional, leaving. You can't blow up our lives like this, he whispered. Hazel looked directly at him. Our lives? She tilted her head slightly. You started blowing up our lives the second you chose another woman over your marriage. Dalton looked physically sick now. I made mistakes. Hazel's eyes hardened slightly. Mistakes are forgetting anniversaries. Her voice lowered. An affair is a series of decisions. That one hit hard. Dalton looked away first. Interesting. He used to make her look away. Not anymore. A phone suddenly buzzed loudly on the dining room table. Dalton glanced down, then froze. Hazel recognized the number immediately from company correspondence. Whitmore Capital. Slowly, Dalton answered. Hello. Silence filled the room while he listened. Hazel watched the color disappear from his face in real time. Yes, Dalton said tightly. I understand. Pause. No, that's not necessary. Another pause. His hand visibly trembled now. I'll be there. Then he hung up. Vivian stepped forward instantly. What happened? Dalton looked at her blankly. Emergency board meeting tomorrow morning. Vivian frowned. That's ridiculous. On Christmas, Dalton swallowed hard. They received documents. Hazel remained silent. Vivian looked between them rapidly. What documents? Dalton didn't answer immediately. Which was answer enough. Vivian's voice sharpened. What exactly did you do? Interesting. For the first time all night, even Vivian sounded uncertain around her own son. Dalton sat heavily in his chair. Exhaustion radiated from him now. Not polished executive confidence, just collapse. Hazel realized something quietly devastating then. Dalton spent years looking powerful because she carried so much emotional weight for him behind the scenes. Without her stabilizing everything, he unraveled quickly. Vivian paced beside the table now. We'll handle this. Dalton stared downward blankly. You don't understand. Hazel did. Corporate investigations, financial misconduct, affair with an employee, misuse of company funds. The board wouldn't care about family image. They'd care about liability. For the first time all night, Vivian looked genuinely afraid. Not socially embarrassed. Afraid. And somehow Hazel felt strangely calm watching it. Because she finally understood something important. Power built on manipulation was always fragile. Dalton looked up toward Hazel slowly. His voice cracked slightly when he spoke. Did you really want to destroy me? The question lingered painfully between them, and despite everything, Hazel answered honestly, "No." Dalton's eyes glistened faintly. Hazel swallowed hard. "I wanted you to love me enough not to destroy us first." That silence afterward felt unbearable, because deep down, everyone in the room finally understood the truth. Hazel hadn't ruined the Whitmore family. She had simply stopped bleeding quietly to keep them comfortable. The emergency board meeting began at 9 o'clock Christmas morning. Because scandals didn't care about holidays. Snow covered Manhattan in icy white, while black luxury sedans lined the curb outside Whitmore Capital headquarters. The massive glass building stood cold and imposing against the gray winter sky, as if even architecture itself had withdrawn warmth from Dalton Whitmore's life overnight. Hazel never entered the building. That was intentional. Instead, she sat quietly inside Naomi's Upper East Side apartment, wrapped in a cream wool sweater, watching snowfall drift past the windows while the city moved on without her marriage. For the first time in years, she felt strangely still. Not healed, not okay, but no longer drowning. Across from her, Naomi reviewed emails on a tablet while occasionally taking calls from her legal team. "They're panicking," Naomi said calmly. Hazel looked up from her untouched tea, the board. Naomi nodded. One affair they could survive. Financial misconduct tied to executive leadership. That's different. Hazel stared silently toward the window again. It still felt surreal. Only a week ago, she was decorating Christmas centerpieces while worrying whether Dalton still loved her. Now, attorneys were investigating him. Funny how quickly illusion collapsed once truth entered the room. Meanwhile, 30 blocks downtown Dalton walked into the Whitmore Capital boardroom looking like a man headed toward execution. The room itself was enormous, and sterile dark wood walls, floor-to-ceiling windows, polished black conference table, stretching beneath cold white lighting. 6 board members already sat waiting. None of them smiled. That alone terrified Dalton, because these people always smiled in public, even while destroying careers. At the far end of the room sat Richard Whitmore, Dalton's uncle and current chairman of the board. His expression looked grim. "Sit down," Richard said quietly. Dalton obeyed immediately. For the first time in his professional life, he looked small. A legal advisor stood near the wall, organizing files, while another executive avoided eye contact entirely. Humiliation radiated through the room like heat. Richard folded his hands slowly. "We received concerning documentation last night." Dalton swallowed hard. "I can explain." One of the female board members interrupted instantly. "We're more interested in whether the SEC will believe your explanation." Dalton felt cold panic spread through his chest. "This is being blown out of proportion." Another board member slid printed documents across the table. Expense reports, transfer records, hotel invoices, Savannah's salary adjustments. Every careless decision now looked catastrophic under fluorescent lighting. "You used corporate accounts during an affair with an employee," the board member said flatly. Dalton rubbed his forehead. "It wasn't like that." Richard looked disgusted. Then what exactly was it like? Silence, because there was no clean explanation. Dalton spent years believing wealth insulated him from consequences. Now consequences sat directly across the table, wearing $1,000 suits. Back in Naomi's apartment, Hazel finally spoke. "Do you think he's scared?" Naomi glanced up briefly. "Yes." Hazel stared down at her tea. "I used to think losing me would scare him." Naomi's expression softened slightly. Men like Dalton rarely fear emotional loss until practical consequences arrive. The truth of that hurt more than Hazel expected, because it confirmed something devastating. Dalton never truly believed she'd leave. Not emotionally, not financially, not physically. Her loyalty became part of the furniture in his life. Permanent, expected, invisible. Naomi's phone buzzed again. She answered calmly. Yes, pause. Then her eyebrows lifted slightly. Interesting. Hazel looked up immediately. What happened? Naomi muted the phone briefly. Savannah Reed retained counsel this morning. Hazel blinked. What? Naomi nodded slowly. She's cooperating. Hazel leaned back against the couch quietly. Of course she was. The illusion shattered for Savannah, too. Once the fantasy of being Dalton's chosen future disappeared, self-preservation took over. Naomi listened to the caller again before hanging up completely. Well, she said calmly, your husband's morning just got worse. Downtown Dalton's hands visibly trembled as another document slid toward him. What is this? The company attorney spoke evenly. Testimony indicating promises of compensation tied to your relationship with Miss Reed. Dalton's stomach dropped. Savannah. Jesus Christ. She's lying. But even he sounded unconvinced now. Richard stared at him with visible disappointment. You had an affair with a subordinate employee while moving company money through unreported channels. Dalton snapped suddenly. I didn't steal anything. No, Richard replied coldly. You were simply arrogant enough to think rules didn't apply to you. That one hit hard. Because it was true. Dalton had spent his entire life protected by the Whitmore name. Protected from failure. Protected from accountability. Protected from consequences. Until Hazel stopped protecting him too. At Naomi's apartment, Hazel finally allowed herself to cry. Not dramatically. Quietly. The kind of tears that came after emotional exhaustion finally reached its limit. Naomi sat beside her carefully. This isn't weakness. Hazel wiped beneath her eyes quickly. I know, but her voice cracked anyway. Part of me still misses him. Naomi nodded without judgment. Of course you do. Hazel stared ahead numbly. I hate that. No, Naomi said softly. You hate that someone you loved became unrecognizable. That distinction mattered, because Hazel no longer missed the man Dalton actually became. She missed the version she thought existed. The man who once stood in the rain outside a Chicago cafe making her laugh over spilled coffee. The man who promised she was his peace. The tragedy wasn't losing Dalton. It was realizing that man may never have existed fully at all. Her phone buzzed suddenly on the coffee table. Vivian. Hazel stared at the screen silently. Naomi raised an eyebrow. You answering? Hazel hesitated, then picked up. Vivian's voice sounded completely different now. No polished superiority. No elegant cruelty. Just desperation hidden beneath forced control. Hazel. Hazel remained quiet. Vivian inhaled sharply. This situation has spiraled far enough. Hazel almost laughed. Interesting. Now Vivian believed things had gone too far. Not during years of emotional abuse. Not during the affair. Only now that consequences reached the Whitmore family itself. What do you want? Hazel asked, calmly. Vivian lowered her voice. Call off your lawyer. Hazel stared ahead in disbelief. You think Naomi created this? You exposed private matters publicly. No, Hazel replied softly. Dalton created private matters publicly the moment he humiliated his marriage. Vivian's breathing tightened. You're destroying this family. That sentence finally exhausted Hazel completely. Because even now, even after everything, Vivian still refused to acknowledge the actual source of destruction. Hazel spoke quietly. You know what's amazing? Vivian fell silent. For years, I kept trying to become someone your family could love. Hazel's voice trembled slightly now. And the entire time, none of you were becoming people worth loving back. Silence. Heavy. Painful. Real. For the first time ever, Vivian Whitmore had absolutely nothing to say. Hazel hung up gently. Across the room, Naomi watched her carefully. You okay? Hazel exhaled slowly. No. Then, after a pause, but I think I'm finally becoming someone I recognize again. Meanwhile, 40 floors above Manhattan, the Whitmore board reached its conclusion. Richard folded his hands across the conference table. Pending formal investigation, you are suspended, effective immediately. Dalton stared blankly, the words barely processed. Suspended, removed, humiliated. Everything he spent years building was collapsing in less than 24 hours. And suddenly, horrifyingly, the thing hurting most wasn't even the company. It was the empty space where Hazel used to stand beside him through every disaster. Because for the first time in his life, Dalton Whitmore had nobody left willing to save him from himself. 3 weeks after Christmas, Dalton Whitmore stood outside Hazel's new apartment building in Manhattan, holding flowers that already looked pathetic in his hands. Snow drifted lightly across the sidewalk, while yellow taxi lights blurred through the evening traffic behind him. He almost didn't recognize himself anymore. Not because of the suspension, not because of the lawyers, not even because Savannah had vanished from his life. The second Whitmore capital became radioactive. It was because silence had finally caught up to him. For years, Hazel filled every quiet space in his world. Now every room echoed. His penthouse felt cold, empty, too large. He never realized how much emotional warmth she carried until it disappeared completely. Dalton stared up at the apartment windows again. Part of him still couldn't believe she actually left. Even after everything. Especially after everything. Because Hazel always stayed. That was the problem. He built his entire sense of security around the assumption that she would survive anything he did to her. Now he understood how dangerous that assumption had been. The doorman opened the building entrance politely. "You okay there, sir?" Dalton blinked. "Yeah." "No. Not even close." 20 minutes later, Hazel opened her apartment door wearing soft gray lounge clothes and reading glasses, her hair loosely tied back. For one disorienting second, Dalton forgot every speech he prepared. Because she looked peaceful. Not devastated. Not hysterical. Peaceful. And somehow that hurt more than anger ever could. Hazel stared at him calmly. "What are you doing here?" Dalton held up the flowers awkwardly. "I wanted to talk." Her eyes moved briefly toward the bouquet, then back to him. "You could have emailed." The emotional distance in her voice physically hurt. Not cruelty, indifference. He swallowed hard. "Please." Several long seconds passed before Hazel finally stepped aside silently. Dalton entered the apartment slowly. It was beautiful. Warm lighting, bookshelves, architectural sketches spread across a dining table, music playing softly somewhere in the background. It felt more like Hazel than the Connecticut mansion ever had. And suddenly Dalton realized something devastating. His wife had spent years disappearing inside his world. Now outside it, she was slowly becoming visible again. Hazel closed the door quietly. "You have 5 minutes." The formality of that sentence nearly shattered him. 5 minutes. After 8 years together. Dalton set the flowers down carefully on the kitchen counter. Hazel didn't touch them. Of course she didn't. He looked around the apartment again. "You moved fast." Hazel folded her arms lightly. "I had motivation." That landed exactly the way it deserved to. Dalton exhaled shakily. "I deserve that." Hazel didn't answer. The silence between them no longer felt intimate. Just final. Dalton rubbed his hands together nervously. "I know I ruined everything." Hazel looked at him carefully. For the first time in weeks, he looked stripped down to something honest. No executive confidence, no polished charm. Just regret. Real regret. Too late. I keep replaying everything Dalton admitted quietly. Every conversation. Every time you tried to tell me something was wrong. Hazel's face remained unreadable. I should have listened. "Yes," she said softly. You should have. No screaming, no dramatic accusation. Somehow her calmness made the guilt unbearable. Dalton looked down briefly. My entire life is collapsing. Hazel's expression shifted slightly then. Not satisfaction. Sadness. Because once upon a time, hearing Dalton hurt would have devastated her too. But now she just felt tired. You know what's strange? Hazel said quietly. Dalton looked up immediately. I spent years terrified of losing you. Her voice remained calm. And then it happened. Silence. Hazel glanced toward the window where snow drifted beyond Manhattan lights, and somehow she whispered, surviving, you hurt less than surviving your disrespect. That sentence nearly broke him. Dalton sat down slowly at the edge of the couch. I never wanted to hurt you. Hazel looked at him for a long moment, then finally asked the question sitting between them for weeks. Then why did you? Dalton opened his mouth, closed it again, because there was no good answer, no explanation clean enough. He ran a hand through his hair weakly. He swallowed hard. I think I became the kind of man who always needed admiration. Hazel said nothing, and so he kept going. Savannah made me feel important, exciting, successful. The honesty sounded ugly out loud, childish, fragile. Dalton's voice cracked slightly. And you? He looked at Hazel painfully. You loved me even when I didn't deserve it. Hazel stared at him quietly. That's not romantic, Dalton. His eyes lowered instantly. No, it wasn't. It was tragic. I let my mother control too much, he admitted. Hazel almost laughed softly at that. Too much. Vivian practically directed their entire marriage while Dalton hid behind silence. You always chose the easier woman to disappoint, Hazel said quietly. Dalton looked confused. What? You disappointed me because you knew I'd forgive you. The truth hit him visibly. Hazel stepped closer, slowly. But you were terrified of disappointing Vivian. Her eyes glistened faintly now. So eventually I became the emotional sacrifice that kept your life comfortable. Dalton looked destroyed, hearing it spoken aloud, because deep down he knew it was true. Hazel sat across from him, exhaustion settling into her posture. You know what the worst part was? Dalton shook his head silently. I kept blaming myself for your emotional absence. Her voice trembled slightly now, despite her control. I changed the way I dressed, the way I spoke. I gave up my career. I kept making myself smaller, trying to become someone easy to love. Dalton closed his eyes briefly. God. He remembered all of it. Every compromise she made. Every time he accepted it without question. Hazel laughed softly through visible pain. And the entire time the problem wasn't that I was too much. She looked directly at him. It's that you were never enough to protect what you had. That one shattered him completely. Dalton's eyes filled instantly. I'm sorry. Hazel looked away. Because years ago, those words would have saved her. Now they just arrived too late to matter. I know, she whispered. Silence stretched softly through the apartment. Not violent anymore, just sad. Finally, Dalton spoke again. Do you think there's any chance for us? Hazel stared at him for several long seconds. And suddenly, she saw him clearly one final time. Not the villain, not the love of her life, just a weak man who realized the value of loyalty after destroying it. Slowly, Hazel reached toward her left hand. The wedding ring still sat there. Simple platinum. 8 years of memories wrapped around one piece of metal. Dalton watched silently as she slid it off her finger. The movement felt unbearably final. Hazel held the ring in her palm for a moment, then gently placed it on the coffee table between them. Dalton's breathing visibly shook. You didn't lose me on Christmas, Hazel said softly. His eyes lifted toward hers immediately. "You lost me slowly," she whispered. "Every time you watched me hurt and decided your comfort mattered more." Tears filled Dalton's eyes completely now. Real ones. But Hazel no longer felt responsible for fixing them. That was the difference. Finally. After years of emotional exhaustion, Hazel Foster was no longer trying to save the man who broke her. By February, Manhattan no longer felt cold to Hazel. It felt alive. The city moved fast enough that grief didn't get to sit still for long. Taxi horns echoed through early mornings, steam curled from subway grates beneath winter skies, and somewhere between crowded coffee shops and late-night drafting sessions, Hazel slowly started becoming herself again. Not the version shaped by Dalton. Not the woman who spent years apologizing for existing too loudly inside wealthy rooms. Herself. And it terrified her how long she had been gone. Hazel stood near the massive windows of a Brooklyn design studio, reviewing architectural renderings while sunlight spilled across long drafting tables. "You're doing it again," a voice teased nearby. Hazel looked up. Her new colleague, Marcus Bennett, leaned against the doorway holding coffee. "What, you disappear into your work like the building might collapse if you blink?" Hazel laughed softly. "I forgot how much I missed this," and she meant it. After the separation, one of Naomi's clients connected Hazel with a boutique architecture firm specializing in luxury, urban restoration projects. At first, Hazel doubted herself constantly. 8 years away from full-time architecture felt enormous. But talent didn't disappear just because life interrupted it. And once she started designing again, really designing something dormant inside her, woke up immediately. The first time a client praised one of her concepts, Hazel nearly cried in the elevator afterward. Not because of the compliment, because she finally remembered who she was before survival consumed her. That realization hurt. Healing often did. One evening after work, Hazel sat across from Naomi inside a dimly lit wine bar downtown while snow tapped softly against the windows outside. "You look lighter," Naomi observed. Hazel smiled faintly. "I feel quieter." Good quiet or heartbreak quiet? Hazel thought about it carefully. Both. Naomi nodded, knowingly. That was the thing nobody talked about after escaping toxic relationships. Freedom came with grief, too. Hazel still missed things sometimes. Morning coffee beside Dalton. Inside jokes. Old memories before everything became poisoned. But she no longer confused missing someone with needing them back. That distinction saved her. Naomi swirled wine slowly inside her glass. "There's something I never told you." Hazel frowned slightly. "That sounds ominous." "It's annoying, actually." Hazel leaned back. "Okay." Naomi hesitated briefly. "About 5 years ago, your name came across a development shortlist for a major Chicago architecture project." Hazel blinked immediately. What Naomi nodded slowly. "You were being considered for senior design leadership." Hazel stared at her in disbelief. "I never heard about that." Naomi sighed. "I know." A strange feeling settled heavily into Hazel's stomach. Why Naomi looked uncomfortable for the first time all evening. Because Vivian Whitmore made sure you didn't. The restaurant noise around Hazel suddenly blurred into distant static. "What are you talking about?" Naomi leaned forward quietly. "One of the consulting executives involved was a former client of mine. Your name came up recently after the divorce started making rounds socially." Hazel's chest tightened painfully, and Naomi exhaled softly. "Vivian privately told them accepting the position would destabilize your marriage and create tension for Dalton's career trajectory." Hazel stared at her silently. "No. No, that couldn't be real." "She interfered," Hazel whispered. Naomi nodded. They went with another candidate. For several seconds, Hazel genuinely couldn't breathe. The betrayal felt different from the affair. Deeper, somehow. Because this wasn't just emotional cruelty. Vivian deliberately sabotaged her future. And Dalton probably knew. Hazel looked down at her trembling hands. 5 years ago. 5 years ago, she still believed sacrifice was love. Meanwhile, Vivian quietly erased opportunities behind her back while Dalton built his empire using Hazel's support. The rage came suddenly, sharp and hot. Not explosive. Worse. Controlled. "She took years from me," Hazel whispered. Naomi's voice softened. "No." Hazel looked up. "She delayed you," Naomi corrected carefully. "That's different." Tears filled Hazel's eyes instantly, because for the first time in a very long time, someone spoke to her like her future still existed. Not as Dalton's wife, not as a Whitmore accessory, as Hazel. Later that night, Hazel walked home through Manhattan wrapped in her wool coat while city lights blurred across wet streets. 5 years. She could have rebuilt her career years ago, could have reclaimed herself sooner, and suddenly, grief crashed into her harder than the affair ever had. Not grief over Dalton, grief over herself, over the woman who kept shrinking to preserve relationships that were slowly suffocating her. Hazel stopped walking near a bookstore window, glowing warmly against the winter night. Her reflection stared back at her. Older, sadder in some ways, but stronger too. Not polished Whitmore perfection. Real strength. The kind born from surviving disappointment without becoming cruel afterward. Her phone buzzed softly inside her coat pocket. An email notification. Hazel almost ignored it. Then she noticed the subject line. Women in Leadership Summit Speaker Invitation. Her brows lifted immediately. Confused, Hazel opened the message right there on the sidewalk. The organizers had apparently heard about the Whitmore scandal through New York professional circles. But instead of wanting gossip, they wanted Hazel herself. Specifically her story. Themes of resilience, career rebuilding, self-worth after emotional collapse. Hazel stared at the email for a long moment. 6 months ago, she barely recognized herself in mirrors. Now people wanted to hear her speak. Life was strange like that. Pain either buried women or introduced them to themselves. A week later, Hazel stood backstage inside a Manhattan conference center while hundreds of women filled the auditorium beyond the curtains. Her hands trembled slightly around the note cards she barely needed. "You nervous?" Naomi asked beside her. Hazel laughed softly, terrified. Naomi smiled. "Good. Means it matters." Hazel peeked toward the stage lights. The audience blurred together beyond the curtain. Corporate executives, young professionals, divorced mothers, women rebuilding themselves in ways both visible and invisible. Hazel suddenly understood something powerful. She wasn't the only woman who spent years abandoning herself to keep love alive. That realization broke her heart a little, and healed it too. The event coordinator approached. "You're up in 2 minutes." Hazel inhaled slowly. Her pulse thundered in her ears. Naomi touched her arm gently. "Whatever happens up there," she said softly. "Remember, this version of yourself belongs to you now." That nearly made Hazel cry immediately. Instead, she nodded once. Then the announcer called her name. The audience applauded warmly as Hazel stepped onto the stage beneath bright white lights. For one terrifying second, she froze. Then she looked out across the crowd. And suddenly, she wasn't afraid anymore. Because after surviving humiliation, betrayal, emotional abandonment, and the destruction of her marriage, speaking honestly no longer felt dangerous. It felt freeing. Hazel walked slowly toward the microphone. And somewhere in the back of the room, for the very first time, she finally understood that losing the Whitmore family had never actually ruined her life. It gave her back the chance to build one that belonged to her. The stage lights were warmer than Hazel expected, soft gold against her skin, gentle enough that she could almost forget hundreds of people were watching her. Almost. The applause slowly faded as she stepped toward the microphone, her heartbeat loud in her chest. For one brief second, fear returned. Not fear of public speaking, fear of being seen honestly, because for years, Hazel had survived by making herself emotionally smaller, safer, easier to digest. Now she stood in front of an audience with nothing left to hide. She inhaled slowly, then smiled. "Hi," she began softly. "My name is Hazel Foster." The room quieted instantly. Hazel glanced down briefly at the note cards in her hands before setting them aside completely. No script, no performance, just truth. A year ago, she continued, "I thought being loved meant enduring things quietly." Several women in the audience visibly shifted. Hazel noticed immediately. Recognition. Pain recognized pain faster than anything else. She folded her hands lightly. "I believed loyalty meant sacrificing myself to keep relationships alive. My marriage, my husband's career, his family's approval." A faint, bittersweet smile touched her lips, and eventually I became so focused on preserving everyone else's comfort. I disappeared inside my own life. The silence in the room felt heavy now. Not awkward, emotional. Hazel continued carefully. "My husband cheated on me. No dramatic reaction, just truth. And somehow, that wasn't even the part that broke me most." Her voice softened slightly. "What broke me was realizing how many years I spent accepting emotional neglect because I thought love meant patience." Several women nodded subtly now. Hazel saw tears already forming in some eyes, because women understood this story intimately. Maybe not her exact marriage, but the feeling, the shrinking, the constant emotional compromise mistaken for maturity. Hazel walked slowly across the stage. "I kept thinking if I loved harder, gave more, became easier, eventually I'd be treated gently in return." Her eyes glistened faintly. "That's not love." The room stayed completely silent. Hazel smiled sadly. "That's survival." A woman near the front wiped tears from her face openly now. Hazel's chest tightened unexpectedly, because she suddenly understood something bigger than her own story. Women were taught to endure almost everything before leaving. Loneliness, disrespect, emotional abandonment, humiliation, and then society still called them dramatic when they finally broke. Hazel leaned lightly against the podium. "My mother-in-law once told me kindness wasn't enough to sustain a marriage." A few bitter laughs moved through the audience. Hazel nodded slowly, and for a long time, I believed her. She looked down briefly before continuing. "But now I think kindness is actually one of the most dangerous things to give the wrong people." The audience went quiet again. "Because selfish people don't see kindness as love," Hazel said softly. "They see it as permission." That line hit the room hard. Hazel felt it instantly. The emotional shift, the recognition. She continued carefully, honestly. "I used to think healing meant becoming unhurt." Her smile softened slightly. "But healing is actually learning that someone else's inability to love you properly was never proof that you were hard to love." Tears burned behind her eyes now. Real ones. Not from weakness, from release. For years, Hazel carried shame that never belonged to her. The affair, the infertility, the criticism, the emotional rejection. She carried all of it like evidence she failed somehow. Now she understood the truth. People who benefit from your silence will always make your pain sound unreasonable. Hazel looked out across the audience again. "I'm not standing here because I became fearless." Her voice trembled slightly. "I'm standing here because eventually the fear of losing myself became bigger than the fear of losing my marriage." That one nearly broke the room. Several women applauded softly. Others cried openly now. Hazel inhaled shakily. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel ashamed of taking up emotional space. In the back row of the auditorium, Dalton Whitmore sat completely still. Hazel never saw him arrive, but halfway through her speech, she noticed him standing near the shadows beside the rear exit. and strangely seeing him didn't destroy her anymore. That realization felt almost holy. Dalton looked thinner now, more tired. The sharp executive confidence that once defined him had faded into something quieter, human. Regret aged people quickly. Hazel held his gaze for only a second before continuing. Because her life no longer revolved around whether he was watching. That was the real freedom. I used to think losing my marriage meant losing my future, Hazel said softly. Then a small smile touched her lips. But sometimes the thing that breaks your heart is also the thing that finally introduces you to yourself. The audience applauded louder this time. Hazel laughed softly through tears. And honestly, I still have hard days. That vulnerability made the room soften immediately again. Some mornings I still wake up angry. Some nights I still grieve the woman I used to be. Her voice lowered. But I don't miss being emotionally abandoned while pretending everything was okay. A quiet murmur of agreement moved through the audience. Hazel smiled gently. You know what surprised me most after leaving? She paused briefly. Peace. The word lingered beautifully in the room. Not revenge, not winning. Her eyes drifted toward the back row once more, very briefly. Peace. Dalton lowered his gaze immediately. Hazel continued, peace is underrated when you've spent years surviving chaos. The applause this time came immediately. Longer, warmer. Hazel's chest tightened emotionally as she looked out across the crowd. For years, she begged to be chosen by people incapable of valuing her properly. Now she stood inside a room full of strangers who understood her without asking her to become smaller first. That mattered, more than she could explain. Hazel stepped back toward the microphone for her closing words. When someone truly loves you, she said softly, you won't constantly feel like you're auditioning for basic respect. The room fell silent again. And if you're sacrificing your voice, your dreams, your peace, or your self-worth just to keep someone beside you. She shook her head gently. That's not love. A tear slipped down Hazel's cheek finally. She smiled anyway. Sometimes losing the relationship is how you finally save yourself. The audience rose to their feet almost instantly. Applause thundered through the auditorium. Some women cried openly. Others smiled through tears. Hazel stood there stunned for a moment beneath the lights while emotion crashed through her chest all at once. Not triumph, not revenge. Freedom. Real freedom. As the applause continued, Hazel glanced once more toward the back of the room. Dalton was gone. And surprisingly, that felt right too. Later that evening, Hazel stepped outside into the cold Manhattan night wrapped in her wool coat while snow drifted softly beneath glowing city lights. The world felt quiet, peaceful, alive. For the first time in years, there was nobody beside her demanding she become smaller to deserve love. Hazel smiled softly to herself as she walked down the crowded sidewalk. Not because her life became perfect, but because it finally belonged to her again. Some of the deepest heartbreaks in life do not come from being unloved. They come from slowly abandoning yourself while trying to earn love from people who only value your silence, your sacrifice, and your ability to endure pain, Isan's quietly. Hazel's story is painful because it feels real. So many people stay too long in relationships where they are constantly shrinking themselves just to keep the peace. They apologize for their emotions, ignore disrespect, and convince themselves that loyalty means suffering in silence. But real love should never require you to lose your voice, your dreams, or your self-worth in order to keep someone beside you. One of the hardest lessons in life is realizing that being kind does not mean you must tolerate cruelty. Having a good heart does not mean allowing people to break it repeatedly. And sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is walk away from the very people they once begged to stay. The truth is, toxic people often realize your value only after they lose access to your loyalty. But healing begins the moment you stop trying to prove your worth to people committed to misunderstanding you. Hazel didn't become powerful because she got revenge. She became powerful because she finally chose herself. She stopped begging for respect and started believing she deserved it naturally. That is where real healing begins. If this story touched you in any way, take a moment to ask yourself, have you ever stayed quiet while someone slowly broke your spirit? Have you ever made yourself smaller just to be loved? If you connected with Hazel's journey, share your thoughts in the comments. Your story might help someone else feel less alone. And if you enjoy emotional dramas about healing, betrayal, self-worth, and strong women rising after heartbreak, don't forget to subscribe and join us for more stories that remind people they are never too broken to start over.